You know that feeling when you just have to know the answer and uncertainty is like just really uncomfortable.
Yeah, like that itch you can't scratch.
Exactly. Well, you listeners send in some fascinating sources looking right at this basic human drive for clarity. Researchers actually call it the need for cognitive closure.
Right, NCC for short.
And it turns out this need is kind of quietly pulling the strings on a lot of things. Stuff like how much we worry or the kinds of risks we take.
It's got surprising reach.
Totally. So today, we're going to dive deep into that. See how this urge for definite answers shapes, well, how we see things and the choices we make. It gets pretty interesting.
And a good starting point is probably where the idea really got firmed up, right? With Kriglansky and Webster back in the mid-90s.
Yeah. Tell us about their definition.
Well, they define this need for cognitive closure, NCC, as basically a strong desire for a clear, solid answer to a question. Any question, really. And importantly, it comes with a real aversion to ambiguity. We just don't like feeling uncertain.
So it's less about needing to be right and more about just wanting the question settled. Off the table.
Precisely. It's not necessarily about the best answer or the most accurate one in the long run. It's about getting an answer, a definite one, to just reduce that uncertainty, close the mental loop. You know?
Okay, I get that. And it's not like an on-off switch, is it? You said it can vary.
Exactly right. Some people generally have a higher need for closure as part of their personality. It's kind of stable for them. But for anyone, the situation can crank that need up or down.
Ah, so context matters. Like if you're under pressure or something.
Yeah, things like time pressure, noise, even just being tired can make you crave closure more intensely. But it's also a trait, a baseline some people have more of.
And Kruglansky and Webster, they pointed out a couple of tendencies that go along with this need. Something about urgency.
Yes, urgency and permanence. Two key tendencies.
Okay, what's urgency about? Sounds straightforward.
It pretty much is. Urgency is that push to get closure quickly. If your NCC is high, you're motivated to find the fastest path to a firm answer. Just get it done.
Right. And permanence. That sounds like digging your heels in.
Kind of. Permanence is the tendency to keep that closure once you've got it. You want to maintain it, stick with that answer.
So you're less likely to revisit it or consider new info.
Exactly. Less inclined to reopen the case, so to speak. Yeah. And these two things together, wanting an answer fast and wanting to stick with it, they have really broad effects on how we think.
Which brings us neatly to the first study you flagged, the one connecting cognitive closure and fear of crime. Seems like a bit of a leap at first glance.
Doesn't it? But think about it. Crime itself is a huge source of uncertainty, right? Loss of control, unpredictable threats.
Ah, okay. So the researchers thought maybe people who hate uncertainty in general would worry more about crime specifically?
That was the core idea. This study, done across Italy, Bulgaria, and Lithuania back in 2009, looked exactly at that. Does a higher need for cognitive closure link up with more worry about being a victim?
And they had specific hypotheses like H8 and H9.
They did. H8 was pretty direct. Higher NCC predicts more worry about crime. Simple enough.
Okay.
H9 was a bit more nuanced. It suggested NCC could moderate the link between how likely you think crime is and how much you worry.
Moderate, meaning?
Meaning the effect changes depending on your NCC level. So maybe people high in NCC worry especially much about crimes they think are likely to happen. The likelihood hits them harder, perhaps.
Gotcha. So how'd they measure all this? Must have been a big survey.
It was pretty extensive. They used computer-assisted personal interviews, CAPI, with representative samples in all 3 countries. Big sample sizes, too. Over 1,000 adults in each place.
Representative how? Like different ages, genders?
Exactly. They used quotas for region, city size, gender, age, making sure the sample reflected the population. Response rates varied a bit, like 45% in Italy, higher in Bulgaria, a bit lower in Lithuania, but overall solid data collection from a diverse group.
And what kind of worry were they asking about? Just general anxiety?
No, they asked specifically about worry over home burglary, someone breaking in and stealing something and being physically attacked in public.
Okay, common fears.
Right. And they also asked how much that worry affected their quality of life. Was it serious, some effect, or, no real impact?
And how did they get at the risk part? How likely people thought it was?
They broke risk perception down into 3 bits. Perceived likelihood. How likely do you think these crimes are around here?
Makes sense.
Perceived consequences. If it did happen, how bad would it be?
Right.
And perceived control. How much do you feel you can actually do to stop it happening to you?
Right. Those 3 angles. So they crunched the numbers. What popped out? Was there a strong link between needing closure and fearing crime.
Well, the most statistically significant finding, meaning it's unlikely, just due a chance, was about the consequences.
Oh, interesting. Not the likelihood.
Not primarily, no. People with a high need for cognitive closure tended to believe the negative consequences of being victimized would be higher, more severe.
Huh. So they didn't necessarily think it was more likely to happen or that they had less control.
Not based on these findings, no. The significant link was specifically with imagining the outcome as worse if they were victimized. This actually backed up another hypothesis they had, H11.
Wow. That's quite specific. So the need for closure kind of amplifies the perceived impact of the negative event.
That seems to be the connection the study uncovered. And importantly, they controlled for things like gender, age, country, the usual suspects, to make sure it wasn't just those factors driving the result.
Okay, fascinating. Let's pivot now to the second paper. This one looked at NCC and risk-taking more broadly.
Right. Need for cognitive closure decreases risk-taking and motivates discounting of delayed rewards. Pretty clear title.
Yeah, kind of gives the game away. So the thinking here is, if you hate uncertainty, you probably don't like risky bets either.
That's the core logic. Uncertainty is inherent in risk. So the main hypothesis was straightforward. People high in NCC would be more risk-averse.
Less likely to gamble, basically.
So less likely to gamble, less likely to choose risky options in various situations, and also less likely to wait for a bigger reward later, preferring a smaller one now. That's the delay discounting part. They prefer the sure thing, and they prefer it sooner.
Okay. And they tested this in a few different ways.
They did, using 3 separate studies. Study 1 was more survey-based. They asked people about different activities, ethical choices, financial ones, health stuff, social situations, even recreation.
Like, would you go bungee jumping or?
Stuff like that, yeah. They assessed perceived risk for each activity and willingness to actually do it. And sure enough, high NCC folks saw more risk across the board.
They perceived more danger.
Yes, and partly because they perceived more danger, they were less willing to engage in those activities. The perception of risk seemed to be the mediator, the pathway for the effect.
Okay, that connects back to the crime study a bit, perceiving negative outcomes more intensely. What about study 2? That used a specific task.
It did. They used something called the Columbia Card task, the cold version.
Cold, as opposed to?
As opposed to hot, which means less immediate emotional involvement. In the cold CCT, you decide how many cards to turn over from a deck. Some cards win you points, but one lost card wipes out everything for that round.
High stakes.
Potentially. More cards mean potentially more points, but also a higher chance of hitting the lost card. The cold part is key. You don't get immediate feedback after each card flip. You make your choice, then find out the result later. It engages more deliberate, calculated thinking.
And the finding? High NCC people
played it safer. They chose to turn over fewer cards on average. Less risky choices in that calculated setting.
All right. Then study 3 went for the hot version, the more emotional side.
Exactly. They used the balloon analog risk task, or BART. Maybe you've heard of it. You pump up a virtual balloon.
Right. Pump, pump, pump. More points.
But it could pop at any time. If it pops, you lose all the points for that balloon. You have to decide when to stop pumping and bank the points.
Very immediate feedback there. Feels more like gambling.
It does. It's considered a more effective, emotionally driven task. And again, same pattern. People high in NCC showed less risk-taking. They pumped the balloons fewer times on average before cashing out.
Wow. Consistent across both cold calculation and hot emotion.
Seems so. And study 3 also included that delayed discounting task we mentioned earlier.
Right. The choice between money now or more money later.
Yep. Small reward now or larger reward after a delay. And again, consistent with the hypothesis, high NCC individuals were more likely to take the smaller immediate payout.
They discounted the future reward more heavily.
Correct. Less willing to wait, even for a bigger gain. So across the board, perceptions of everyday risk, strategic tasks, emotional tasks, waiting for rewards high NCC, consistently linked to more caution, more preference for certainty and immediacy.
That dislike of uncertainty really seems to permeate a lot of decisions.
It paints a pretty clear picture, doesn't it? That fundamental aversion seems to shape how we weigh risk and reward in quite diverse ways.
Okay, but then the third paper throws a bit of a methodological wrench in the works. It questions how we actually measure this NCC thing.
Right. This paper by Newberg, Judice, and West takes a critical look at the standard measure, the need for cognitive closure scale, the NFCS.
The tool everyone uses to figure out someone's NCC level.
Exactly. And their main argument is essentially maybe the scale isn't measuring just one single thing, like Kruglanski and Webster originally proposed.
Not unidimensional.
Correct. They argue it might be multidimensional, potentially mashing together different, though related motivations. Like maybe it mixes up wanting quick answers with just generally preferring things to be simple and structured.
But didn't Kruglanski and Webster themselves say the scale had different parts or facets?
They did acknowledge that. They proposed 5 facets within the NFCS. Preference for order, preference for predictability, decisiveness, discomfort with ambiguity, and closed-mindedness.
Okay, so 5 aspects contributing to the overall score.
That was the idea. But Newberg and colleagues tested this statistically. They used confirmatory factor analysis to see if the data really fit a single-factor model or that 5-factor model.
Did it fit?
Not very well, according to their analysis. The single-factor model was a poor fit, and even the 5-factor model was only described as a modest improvement. It suggests the scale isn't cleanly measuring just one thing, or even 5 clearly separate things.
So the structure isn't as neat as proposed.
And another red flag they raised. Those 5 facets don't always correlate positively with each other. If they're all supposed to be part of the same underlying need for closure, you generally expect them to kind of move together, right?
Yeah, you'd think someone high on one would likely be at least somewhat high on the others.
But that wasn't always the case, which further questions if they're all tapping into the exact same core construct.
Okay, that's a significant challenge to the scale's unity.
Definitely. And maybe even more telling, they found these facets related differently to other personality traits.
Like the big 5. Or need for cognition.
Exactly. For instance, preference for order and closed-mindedness were negatively related to need for cognition liking thinking. People high on those facets seem to enjoy effortful thinking less.
Okay.
But preference for order and decisiveness were positively related to agreeableness.
Different patterns emerging.
Right. And they found opposing relationships with neuroticism, too. Decisiveness was linked to lower neuroticism, less negative emotion, but discomfort with ambiguity was linked to higher neuroticism.
Wow. So being decisive and hating ambiguity, which both sound like part of needing closure, relate to emotional stability in opposite ways.
Seems so. And just looking at the total NFCS score would totally mask those nuances. It smooths over potentially important distinctions.
So the total score might be hiding more than it reveals sometimes.
That's the concern they raise. And one final point they made was about redundancy. They found significant overlap between some NFCS facets and other existing scales.
Meaning the NFCS might just be remeasuring things we already have tools for.
To some extent, yes. The preference for order and predictability facets looked a lot like the personal need for structure scale. And the decisiveness facet overlapped heavily with the personal fear of invalidity scale, basically, the fear of being wrong.
So maybe NCC isn't one unique thing, but more like a constellation of related tendencies, some of which overlap with other known concepts like needing structure or fearing error.
That's a really good way to put it. It suggests the whole picture of NCC might be more complex, more intricate than a single scale score might suggest. It calls for a more nuanced look.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together now. We've gone through the definition, the links to fear of crime, to risk-taking, and now the questions about how it's measured. For listeners trying to make sense of this for themselves, what are the main takeaways?
Well, I think the core idea holds. There's this fundamental desire for clarity, this discomfort with ambiguity, and these studies strongly suggest that if you have a higher level of this need,
You might find yourself actively looking for those clear, simple answers more often.
yes, and you might genuinely feel more uneasy in situations that are uncertain or complex. That could show up as more worry about potential threats, like we saw with crime.
Or being less willing to take chances, like in the risk-taking studies.
Exactly, both financially and maybe even socially or personally.
And it's crucial to stress, again, this isn't about being good or bad, right? High or low NCC isn't better or worse.
Absolutely not. High NCC can make you decisive, quick to act, which can be great, but maybe less open to changing your mind.
Whereas low NCC might mean more open-mindedness, more tolerance for nuance.
But maybe also getting stuck in indecision sometimes. There are trade-offs either way. It's just a different style.
And we also learned it's not set in stone. Our immediate situation can change how much we crave closure at any given moment.
That's such an important piece. Time pressure, stress, fatigue, they can all temporarily boost your need for a quick, firm answer.
But other things, like knowing you'll have to explain your decision.
Like accountability, yeah. That can actually reduce the urgency for closure, make you more willing to think things through more carefully. So it's dynamic.
We also briefly touched on wider implications, like how this might affect social judgments.
Yeah, the risk-taking paper mentioned links between high NCC and things like prejudice or negative views of outgroups. That desire for simple categories can sometimes, unfortunately, spill over into how we see people who are different.
Which shows how this seemingly internal need can have real-world social consequences. Okay, so summing up, this need for cognitive closure, this basic desire for clarity, it's a powerful driver. It influences our worries, our choices about risk, how we handle information.
And while researchers are still debating the best way to measure it precisely, the concept itself gives us really valuable insight into why we often feel that pull towards certainty.
So here's something for everyone listening to maybe mull over. Think about times in your own life where you feel that strong pull for a definite answer. Maybe when you're learning something new or making a big decision or even just reading the news.
Yeah, how does that need for closure influence what information you seek out? Do you find yourself drawn to sources that give very clear-cut answers, maybe avoiding the more ambiguous ones?
And how does it feel when things are uncertain? How comfortable are you sitting with ambiguity? Are there times when pushing for a quick answer is helpful? And maybe other times when letting things be uncertain for a bit might lead to a deeper understanding?
It's a great self-reflection exercise, really noticing how that need operates in your own thinking and decision-making.
Absolutely. Yeah. And hey, if this deep dive got you thinking, maybe check out the Need for Cognitive Closure scale online or look into some of the research we talked about. It's a fascinating area. It really is. Lots more to explore there, for sure. Well, that's all we have time for today, but join us next time as we take another deep dive into the amazing complexities of how our minds work.